Share structure. Today what we're going to talk about is the appropriate share structure inside of a corporation. When I say appropriate, I mean in terms of funding, potentially raising funding. There isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way to structure the number of shares inside of an early stage corporation, a startup around formation. But there are certainly some guidelines that people think through, and there are some ideas in share structure that aren't obvious but that are important to understand. First of all, when talking about shares, there are two key concepts. There's authorization and issuance that are basic building block concepts. Authorization means it happens inside of the Articles of Incorporation is where that is executed. But really what you're doing is you're creating a pool of shares. You're saying, okay, there are this many shares in existence. And then issuance is different. That means that those shares have been issued to someone, a shareholder or an employee. And that involves either selling shares as part of the financing or as part of the incorporation's creation, or granting shares to someone as part of their compensation. And you'll hear the terms shares outstanding used, and that means that those shares are now active, if you will, or they're part of the cap table. They'll show up on the capitalization table, and those shares should be considered on the cap table when talking about the company in fully diluted terms. And if you need to know what those things mean, watch our cap table videos. We'll give explanations of those terms as well. The other issue that we should talk about is kind of what happens at formation around share creation, and then we'll talk about some good outcomes and bad outcomes. Right around formation, you're authorizing as many shares as you think you will need. Otherwise, you force yourself to go back and amend the Articles of Incorporation, which can be time-consuming and expensive to have an attorney do. So you're essentially starting by saying, okay, I'm going to authorize this many shares. This is the number I think I'm going to need. Before what? Before a key funding event happens, is how you choose how many shares to authorize. You don't want to amend the articles if you don't have to. And really the major event that people are gearing that decision around has to do with taking VC or institutional investment. So when you do take on an institutional investor or a VC investor, they'll often require what's called preferred stock. And in that case, you're going to amend the Articles of Incorporation and create additional shares. You're going to end up authorizing and issuing additional shares. And that's okay, that's normal for a big funding event like that. But what you're trying to do at incorporation, at formation, is gear your company so that you don't have to make that change until that big funding event happens. So let's look through an example here. In this case, often when you go talk to an attorney in the startup world, they all have slightly different ways of doing this, but they'll authorize between 10 and 15 million shares, and they might issue between 5 and 10 million shares. So you've got 10 or 15 million to play with before you'd have to go back and amend your Articles of Incorporation. But really, they're only issuing 5 or 10 million to the founders or the original investors or whoever is one of the original shareholders. So essentially what that does is it leaves room for you to issue more in the future if you need to. And it's kind of weird, but the reason they do this used to have to do with IPOs. There's an appropriate share pricing that you used to think, and this is more psychological than anything else, around an IPO. And that used to be, somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 to $15 a share. In that case, you'd have to kind of go back in time through your funding evolution, right around company formation and angel investment and VC investment all the way to the IPO. And each one of those steps had an appropriate share price. It's a little less true today, but this used to be where the reasoning came from. So in a good outcome where you were smart and you authorized a bunch and issued a bunch, gave yourself a little room, what it would look like is around formation, share price may be pennies or even fractions of a penny. The angel investor might come in at 10 cents a share. The VC investor might come in at $1 a share, and you might IPO at $10 a share. So that evolution represents the increasing value that your company represents. But essentially, it had more to do with psychology about how shares are purchased. There was one other reason why having a very low share price around formation was important, and that has to do with pricing options, the strike price of an option. And again, if you don't understand any of these terms, you can go watch our other videos that explain what strike price is and how options work. So let's talk about a bad outcome for how we are authorizing and issuing shares. Let's say we go to a cheap online service and we authorize only 1,500 shares of stock. Well, that doesn't give you a lot of room for pricing those shares at a very low level and distributing those shares to a big number of people. So let's say because you only have 1,500, you go forward toward angel investment and now you don't have enough to issue. Well, now you got to go back and amend your articles of incorporation like we mentioned previously, which can be time consuming and costly. So after amending those, you also may end up with a high share price. It's kind of goofy to have a $50 share price early on in the corporation's existence. And in that case, you'd be issuing options at a really high strike price, and it just does bizarre things. And again, some of this is psychological, but it does bizarre things to the way people treat those shares and the way investors look at those shares if they're priced that high. So again, all this has to do with authorization and issuance. You want to try and authorize as many as you think you're going to need before your major funding event and issue those shares that are necessary around incorporation.